Thank you very much, Mr. Boykin, for your remarks and for your support of this event. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to introduce you to the Honorable Marian who was appointed by the President and confirmed by the United States Senate as a judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims in 1986 and again in 2003. She's a graduate of Barnard College, Columbia University, and received her law degree from the Fordham University School of Law. Before being appointed to the United States Court of Federal Claims, Judge Horn served as acting solicitor and principal deputy solicitor at the United States Department of the Interior, and as associate solicitor for general law and deputy associate solicitor for surface mining, also at Interior. She formerly served as deputy assistant general counsel for procurement and financial incentives, senior attorney for the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and litigation attorney at the Department of Energy. Judge Horn is an adjunct professor at the George Washington University Law School. She's also taught as an adjunct professor of law at the Washington College of Law at American University, and will be receiving an invitation to teach here forthwith, because that's clearly missing from her.
Up to you.
Her previous experience includes private law practice and service as a prosecutor and deputy chief of the Appeals Bureau in the District Attorney's Office for Bronx County, New York. Judge Horn's father, Werner Blank, as you'll hear, was a German judge in Berlin when he was removed from the bench by the Nazis for being Jewish. So we really welcome you, Judge Blank Horn. Please give her
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Dean, and thank you to the President of the University, the head of my ABA, and the representatives from the German Embassy and the German Bar. This is very personal, obviously, and I'll try to do this without cracking my voice. I married two of my daughters, and they were taking bets as to how long it would take for my voice to crack. The third one said she couldn't tolerate waiting for that, so she had one of my colleagues do it. But it is a personal thing, and I'm here really to talk about something that's terribly important. I am an academic in my own way. I have always taught pretty much from the beginning of my career, although as an adjunct with daytime duties. And I love to talk, and I'm delighted that there's so many students here, frankly. It's important. I do have a history degree, so it is also important to me, and did a thesis on historiography. So learning from history is something that I think is terribly, terribly important. I'm here to honor my father and mother, my grandmother, and those are the three that made it to this country. Some of the others did not. They escaped from the Holocaust, arrived in this country with a very few financial resources, few acquaintances, and horrible past experience, which continued, frankly, as they continued to receive news from Europe, or worse still, no news at all. No news at all about friends and relatives, and obviously anxiety, little money, and starting out a whole new way of life. I'm on the Court of Federal Claims at this point, the United States Court of Federal Claims, which for those of you that don't know the court, because we don't try to hide, but we are not like a district court. We are a trial court, but we deal with claims against the United States, claims against the sovereign. That's a unique concept in many countries around the world. It's not one that's recognized in many countries around the world where you can't sue the sovereign. And so we deal with government contracts, tax, patents, Fifth Amendment taking claims, Native American claims, variety of other things. Most of our cases are pretty large dollar volume and pretty complex. We get a few of the simple ones, but frankly, because of the way the jurisdictional setup is statutorily enacted, there are other places to go for the lower dollar volumes, and a lot of the more pro se cases that tend to be shorter in duration. It's a court that I love. I actually love my job. I'm very lucky. I've been on the court for over 30 years. I have been fortunate to get 2 presidential appointments to the court, maybe not so fortunate to do 2 Senate confirmations. Neither one of them was wonderful, although one was easier than the other. And the one that was not so easy was because I was the acting solicitor in the Department of Interior, and although they asked me no questions about myself, and I introduced my family and my 3 daughters who were in little pink dresses. They were young at the time. They then sent me 70 pages of questions asking about environmental policy and energy policy related to the Department of Interior. Got through it, but it is quite a process, as all of you have watched recently in the news. I had always wanted to be a prosecutor when I went through law school. And one of the things I would say to all the law students here is, don't close your mind, because serendipity will take over your career. I've had opportunities and wonderful, wonderful mentors, one of whom actually was a death camp liberator. He was the Solicitor of Interior. He's the one who handed me my job, which was both to be the Deputy Solicitor and the Acting Solicitor. And he kept a copy of his death camp photos in his desk. And he pulled them out periodically just for people that he was comfortable with, and said this should keep us all humble, and this should all remind us of the rule of law. And that's a lesson I've taken with me all of the rest of my career. He was formerly a Supreme Court judge on the state of California court, and he took the rule of law very, very seriously, and obviously we've heard today a lot of reasons why that is something we should be doing. I've had a lot of opportunities, one of which has been to be very involved in the establishment of the Holocaust Museum here in Washington. You're at the right place at the right time sometimes. I was the acting solicitor. I was also the deputy solicitor at the same time when the museum really ran into some problems after the statutory enactment to have it established. We had to be sure we had enough money, because there was a requirement to raise a certain amount of money for the matching money that was coming from the government. And we had obviously a lot of counter tensions. There were a lot of refugees and escapees actually on the board of the museum at the beginning. Many of them were major builders here in Washington, D.C., who were very committed to making this museum happen. And so my ability to contribute to that, to sign some of the early documents, to do the land transfer from the government to the museum, to make sure that there was some executive management as they grew into a real museum on the ground with open doors, was an opportunity that I cannot even underestimate at all. When I left to go to the court, we do have this thing called separation of powers. I had to extricate myself out of the museum to some extent, other than to be a supporter and a real advocate for the museum. But my husband joined the board of the Holocaust Museum, which he was on for 12 years through varying administrations of both political parties. And he was on the executive committee and on the content committee when the museum began to assemble its exhibit. So he too comes from a refugee family, although not from Berlin. My father was a Berliner through and through. My mother was born in Munich, but at age 1 moved to Berlin, and they spent a few years together in Berlin after they got married. My husband's family came more from the Hanover region, and so it was kind of logical when the Secretary of Interior said, well, how can we reward you for what has been 2 jobs all at the same time? And I was okay with it, how you did it. I said, consider my husband for the museum board. He's a very political individual, so he could get through the White House for that appointment. And so the family, both sides of the family, have contributed a great deal, I think, to making the history of what happened in Europe at the time, and it wasn't only Germany, known to everybody around the world and keeping that story alive. I stand here as a symbol, really, of opportunity, optimism that this country has to offer. We have been very, very fortunate. I'll never shake that optimism, regardless of strife and division that permeates in the world today. I'm a first-generation American, and that comes with some interesting burdens. I'm the second judge in the family, but I am the first-generation American. My father ordered P blank, and the P was acquired somehow upon immigration here. It was not given to him when he was born. And there's a lot of stories, mostly before he came, where people would acquire completely new names on Ellis Island. He was after Ellis Island, but people were given new names if they were too complicated. His name wasn't that complicated. Blank is relatively easy, although it's pronounced as blank. He was an appellate court judge, Landgerichtsrat in Germany, in Berlin, and he was unceremoniously demoted, disbarred. In an odd way, that turned out to be a favor of sorts to my father and mother. It was an early warning system that they needed to consider leaving. And I wouldn't be here but for the fact that they understood that they needed to leave. My one grandmother was of a generation that sadly thought that older people wouldn't be bothered by the Nazis. She made it out in 1939 through a series, very late obviously, through a series of events, and how we come full circle whenever we talk, through an artists and musicians transport. One of the exchanges of oil for artists that was occurring at the time. Fortunately, it was done by the son of one of her best friends, and along with the artists and musicians, although she was a recognized musician as well, pianist, he put them on the transport along with the rest of them. So his mother and my grandmother got out. Sadly, he went back for the transfer of the oil and he did not get out. But my grandmother came in 1939 at the point that my uncle became a citizen. He had to leave Germany earlier because he had a non-Jewish girlfriend, and those were people who were targeted fairly early in the Nazi experience. At home, I have a lot of documents, actually, that my father, who was very German, very, very German, very organized. He came to dinner in a jacket and tie until he was in his 80s. And I grew up in a very German household. I speak German. I can read German. I don't write it very well. That's the one thing, because it was learned in a social way. But he organized his files, and so when he passed away, I inherited passports, the Holland America line ship on which they came to this country, various other things that are not so nice to look at. And I haven't really cataloged them in any way, but as I prepared for this talk, I kind of went through them and took a look at them again. In that file also is a copy of both of my parents' citizenship papers, something they treasured incredibly proudly. Once my parents arrived in this country after some difficult visa issues, and that was at the American end, not so much the German end. As you may know, if those of you who have gone to the Holocaust Museum, there wasn't a rounding welcome for everybody either on this end. So they had some visa issues. They overcame those. And once they got here, they impressed on me the need to stay aware of current events, to participate in the electoral process, and to contribute back to this country as a responsibility resulting from the gift of citizenship. I'm always concerned with my own kids too. I have 3 daughters, 7 grandchildren, and the grandchildren are 12 and under, so it's a little hard to get that message across, except to the oldest one so far. But I often wonder, how you instill that same sense of responsibility in those who are not first generation. First generation Americans, I think, of all persuasions from all countries, have a little bit different attitude, because the gift of citizenship is very real to us. And how do we make sure that every generation actually thinks about voting, thinks about the process, doing it within the rule of law? After my father was disbarred, my parents began to look around as to where to go. They looked first to Holland. That wouldn't have been a good idea. They looked next to Spain, and under Franco, that would not have been a great idea either. And fortunately, there weren't any good jobs for my father in either of those 2 places, so they kept pounding away at trying to get an American visa. When they got here, the adjustment was enormous. They were lucky. They got here to the United States. Many of their close relatives and friends did not. There are a number of books on children of the Holocaust. People like me, first generation, maybe even second. And I always thought I was sort of unique, just a little different from some of my high school friends. But it turns out I'm really very much a product of that book. I'm just like them. You have that sense of responsibility. I'm not unique. After the realization that Germany would be a problematic place for my father, he really tried to figure out, how do I reconfigure myself? Sadly, of course, without the economic resources, he did not make the right choice, as it turns out. He should have gone back to law school. He did not do that. He needed to make money, and not too long after they came here, I was born. That made that probably even worse. So remember, English was not his first language. He did speak English when he came here to some extent. My mother spoke it better than he did, which gave them an advantage. But she spoke about 5 languages, so for her that was easy. But he looked around and he could study for the accounting exam, the CPA exam at night. So he took the CPA exam, and not having English as a first language. This is all while working too. He passed all parts of the CPA exam on the first try. Many of our colleagues who were born in this country don't do that. So when I say it was sad that he didn't go back to law school, he never liked being an accountant. And I swore, by the way, that I would never do tax cases because he talked about it so much. And of course, now I do tax cases. But I actually like some of them a lot. But he was meant to be a lawyer. He missed his former life terribly. And, the larger accounting firms were not welcoming to immigrants, especially not immigrants whose language as their first one was not English. He stayed practicing as an accountant and paid for the bills that the family accrued, but it was far below his intellectual challenge because he had to stay at a level of accounting with small businesses or individuals that really weren't as intellectually challenging. But he trained me to be a lawyer from the day I was born, I think, because we would have dinner at our house, not only German-style prompt, it was 6:45 every single night. You don't come, you don't eat. My mother would sneak me food if I was late, particularly in high school. But dinner was really a tutorial on current events, on thinking like a lawyer, although I didn't realize that at the time. When I was a prosecutor, he would come to the courthouse and watch me argue. And then we would have lunch or something afterwards, or I'd go to the house for dinner at night. And he would ask questions and make comments. And he was a whole lot smarter than I was about the law at that point. I was brand new, specking out of law school. And he was thinking like a lawyer. I'm not sure I was at that point as much. So it was, a young lawyer with no experience, a more developed lawyer with a lot more experience, even though he didn't understand the American system totally. My mother contributed too. She did typing, secretarial work, and translation work in a couple of languages just to make ends meet. And when there was a typing course offered at my high school, she wouldn't let me take it. And she said, "You're not going to be one like me. You're not going to do these jobs. You're going to do something different and better." And, today's environment, I wish I'd taken typing because I still have to look at the keyboard. I'm pretty fast, but I am not a total touch typist. But nobody could know what was going to happen with the world of computers. One of the most heartwarming and poignant experiences for my parents and for me was my swearing in as a judge the first time. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor swore me in both times at the Supreme Court. She was remarkable in her kindness. She's a standard bearer of the profession as far as I'm concerned. And she swore me in, and the minute she saw my dad, she said, "Judge Blank, how are you?" She treated him like a judge. A little bit later that afternoon, I got a ceremonial welcome to the bench of my court, And I think, Marshall, you're in here somewhere, you know Judge Lawrence Smith. Judge Lawrence Smith was our chief judge at the time, and he gave my father a robe and said, "Come sit on the bench." That was kind of a full circle for the family. You have to remember, too, that I grew up in a small one-bedroom apartment in a not-so-scenic part of Manhattan. I slept in the living room, although I started each night in my parents' room until I went to bed. No TV or car until I was in the late years of high school. No fancy trips, walking up the hill rather than taking the bus for even a small amount. Hand-me-down clothes. But I became the statement for both of my parents that Adolf Hitler and those who followed Hitler's message by their affirmative involvement or cowardly silence had not succeeded. I grew up with a lot of love, fortunately with a premium on education, the pathway out of a diminished economic circumstance, even today, and towards a path of achievement and integration into American society and opportunity. The lessons of history are clear. There is opportunity here. There is evil in the world, and we have to speak up. I also teach actively in rule of law programs. I do it for a number of institutes in town. I've done it for once in a long time ago for Sealy at the American Bar, but not recently. I've tried to crack that. Haven't been able to. It's a very insular group. In many rule of law places, they use their own, the Department of Commerce does as well. But I've done it for a lot of outside institutions. And I do it to developing countries. I've done it also for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, which did a big program for Southern African judges at one time, quite a number of years ago. And we had the chief judges of a lot of the Southern African countries. But I continue to be affiliated with one institute in particular and do everything from government contracts to constitutional to general rule of law. It's a unique opportunity, as far as I'm concerned, to be able to contribute, to be an active part of it, and to be sure that, in fact, we can take the message that you've heard so many times today of democracy, rule of law, so important. When that breaks down, it is the beginning of deterioration of society. And so I consider myself very fortunate that two presidents chose to give me the opportunity to serve this country as a judge and to continue the family tradition. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk to anybody afterwards, and certainly to the students, find your mentors. I have quite a few over the years, and I stay involved with many of them. And I think if I can give back through my teaching, through my rule of law, and through interaction with young lawyers, that I'm doing what my father and mother both would be proud of, which is to continue the rule of law tradition in a safe place and for the future. Thank you so much.